Okay, so I I ended that recording. I'm starting a new one. Um, um, if you're listening to the entire chapter, um, this is the fourth and final section of the chapter. It's titled Russia 1917, Democracy First, then Socialism. But I'm also going to have this as a separate video because my particular interest for reading this chapter in the first place was to see what Kautsky had to say about Russian Revolution 1917. So here we go. The section 4 is titled Russia 1917, quote, Democracy First, then Socialism, end quote. Alright, so here we go. In the manifesto Kautsky drafted for the Gotha Congress that ratified the birth of the USPD, Kautsky had hailed the February Revolution in Russia as a shining example of democratic and socialist politics, contrasting the struggle of the Russian workers to the degeneration of the German, quote, government socialists, end quote. Kautsky then wrote a close analysis of the Russian events in a fundamental article titled Die Aussichten der Russischen Revolution, which surveyed 1. The relationship between democracy and socialism, 2. The relationship between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, 3. The relationship between the proletariat and the peasantry, 4. The international effects of the revolution, both on the world war and on the internal political situation in Central Europe. The consolidation of the Russian Revolution, Kautsky declared, would signal, quote, a new epoch for all Europe, end quote, and in particular would constitute a, quote, powerful advance of the political forces of the toiling classes throughout the capitalist world. Commenting on the internal dynamic of the revolution, Kautsky noted that because of the leading role played by the working class, which possessed a, quote, strong class consciousness, end quote, and leaders armed with the, quote, science of the 20th century, end quote, the revolution had a, quote, predominantly proletarian, end quote, character from the outset. The fundamental question in Russia, therefore, revolved around the roles that would be played by the working class and the bourgeoisie, the, quote, consolidation of the conditions of the new state order, end quote. Kautsky wrote, quote, strictly depends on the question, on this question, rule the proletariat or rule the bourgeoisie, end quote. Kautsky. According to Kautsky, rehearsing many of the essential points of Kautsky's analysis of the 1905 revolution in Russia, the historical peculiarity of the Russian Revolution was that the leading role of the socialist proletariat was combined with general social and economic backwardness and an insufficient numerical expansion of the working class as a social productive force, which made it unthinkable that the Russian Revolution would become a socialist revolution capable of initiating a new form of production superseding capitalism. This contradiction would be resolved only by understanding the function of democracy not merely as a formal procedure, but as a substantive means to assure economic and social development in a context defined by 3 critical factors: the political influence of the proletariat, the needs of the present masses, who had an interest in bourgeois democratic ownership of land, and the weakness of the advanced productive sector, in other words, of industry. Quote, the proletariat, Kautsky wrote, quote, urgently needs 2 things, democracy, and socialism, Democracy means the most extensive political freedoms and rights of the popular masses, the transformation of the institutions of the state and the local administrative bodies into pure instruments of the popular masses. Socialism means the transformation of private production for the market into social production, that is, state, communal, or cooperative production for the needs of society. The proletariat needs both in equal measure, end quote. Kautsky. After these assertions, Kautsky commented, a significant remark in the light of Kautsky's future attitude towards the Bolshevik regime, quote, social production without democracy would become a most oppressive bond. Democracy without socialism would allow the persistence of economic dependence of the proletariat, end quote. Kautsky. Democracy was not an ideal exclusive to the proletariat, but it was the proletariat that now fought for democracy most energetically, since the bourgeoisie could live without democracy, while the proletariat lost all possibilities for action if there was no democracy. Moreover, democracy could be introduced, quote, wherever there was proletarian struggle. Socialism, on the other hand, was an aim characteristic only of the proletariat. The introduction of socialism was impossible if modern forces of production were insufficiently developed, not only because of the consequent technological obstacles, but also, and even more importantly, because the proletariat would be too weak to direct economy and society. The Russian Revolution should thus aim at the consolidation of a democratic republic in which a progressive government could promote the rapid development of modern industry and so strengthen the working class numerically and mature the working class politically. This prospect was possible only in the context of a democratic system. Democracy, the exercise of civic freedoms, facilitated the formation of a proletariat capable of becoming a ruling class and thereby providing the basis for socialism. Quote, democracy, Kautsky wrote, quote, is now even more important than the economic elevation of the proletariat, end quote. Kautsky. Democracy alone constituted the, quote, foundation on which, quote, a process of lasting growth of the popular masses is possible, end quote. Kautsky. Quote, for this reason, end quote, Kautsky continued, the significance of democracy was not that democracy made, quote, the conquest of political positions possible. It also had inestimable value in areas where it offers no immediate practical advantage from the standpoint of realpolitik. In order to liberate themselves, the workers, in addition to growing in numbers and winning certain material advantages, must also become, quote, new men, endowed with those capacities which are necessary for a new order of state and society. These abilities are acquired only through class struggle, which as a process directed by its own participants must not be guided by secret committees that issue orders to the proletarian masses, but requires democratic rights and freedoms, end quote. Kautsky. The backwardness of Russia, Kautsky argued, was patent from the relationship between the city and the country. The urban industrial proletariat in Russia was too weak numerically. In 1913, only 24 million people lived in cities, 150 million in the countryside. Because of the low level of general economic development, this imbalance was aggravated by the lack of adequate communications and the intense social and political isolation of the rural population. In this context, Kautsky held, socialization could not prevail in a democratic political system in the near future, for its necessary preconditions were lacking. Quote, there is no doubt, end quote, Kautsky observed, quote, that Russian capitalism still furnishes too limited a base for development in a socialist direction, end quote. This did not mean that there were no important sectors that should be subjected to measures of public control or should become social property. Indeed, it was necessary to proceed forthwith to the nationalization of the major industries, railroads, mines, and metallurgical complexes. In addition, Kautsky held that the property of the Tsar and the monasteries should be confiscated and the estates of the large landlords nationalized. These sectors, Kautsky said, should be managed by the democratic state in a climate of full freedom for the proletariat. In private industry, the proletariat should enjoy maximum opportunities to defend the proletariat's own interests, protection of labor, the 8-hour-a-day, unemployment insurance, distribution of food products to the working population at low prices. Finally, to cover growing state expenditure, progressive taxes would have to be introduced, falling exclusively on the shoulders of the possessing classes. These, Kautsky argued, were the measures the new Russia needed if the new Russia was to establish a political democracy with an advanced social content. For Kautsky, political democracy was the necessary form of the class struggle in Russia and the proper gauge of the real relationship of class forces. Quote, this, Kautsky commented, quote, may be defined as a bourgeois reformist program and not a program of proletarian revolution, end quote. Kautsky, but it was the only program which, because of this program's advanced reformist character, could take account of the strength of the proletariat and the peasantry on the one hand, and the weakness of the bourgeoisie on the other, and yet, because of its non-socialist character, simultaneously accord with the overall backwardness of modern industry in Russia. The relationship between bourgeois reformism and social revolution depended on the dynamic evolution of social struggle and economic progress. Whether the program leaned, quote, this way or that, end quote, i.e. in a more bourgeois or more proletarian direction, quote, depends on quantitative elements, end quote. However, here, quote, here again, end quote, Kautsky continued, quote, quantity, when sufficiently increased, must yield a new quality. The proletariat, as soon as the proletariat finds its feet, will inevitably do the proletariat's utmost to exploit the situation in the direction outlined above, bracket, i.e. the direction of social revolution, end bracket, and in so doing will clash with the resistance of the capitalist and large landlords. Exactly when this happens will depend on the relative strength of the proletariat, end quote. Kautsky. As for the peasants and the attitude the proletariat should take towards the peasants, Kautsky reiterated Kautsky's analysis of 1905, declaring that the workers had every interest in aiding the peasants to gain land. Once this had been won, the peasants would feel linked to the cause of the revolution, and the counter-revolution would lose the counter-revolution's strength, above all because the great majority of the army was composed of peasants. Quote, when the peasants are won over, the army will also be won to the young republic and will become a force for its defense. End quote. Kautsky's conclusion was that if Russian democracy succeeded in stabilizing Russian democracy's self, the East would be rejoined to the West, and a common road would be opened to the conquest of political power by the proletariat, quote, the mass movement and mass organizations would then be assured the most solid foundation for the conquest of political power in Eastern Europe, at least as firmly as in the West, end quote. Kautsky. It should be noted that the East was to be reunited with the West on the common basis of political democracy as the, quote, general form of the conduct of the social struggle for socialism. One second. In August 1917, Kautsky singled out two urgent necessities for the Russian Revolution. One, the attainment of peace. Two, the convocation of a constituent assembly. It was Kautsky's view that the movement for peace could unite the Russian working class and the progressive parties of the new republic with the action of the Western proletariat in a common framework of democracy. It will also correspond to the need to safeguard Russian democracy itself. Quote, war and democracy are two phenomena that are not easily compatible. ... A rapid peace is indispensable for the success of the Russian Revolution, end quote. Nevertheless, the peace Russia needed was not just any peace at any price. Peace could be real only if that peace was, quote, without annexations and reparations, based on the right of self-determination of peoples on both sides, end quote. Kautsky. It was thus related to the problem of a more general peace. The Russian Revolution must also integrate itself into the action of the International. Quote, revolutionary Russia alone is not capable of concluding peace on the foundations revolutionary Russia chooses. This is a task of the International. It is its duty both to the Russian Revolution and to itself. End quote. Kautsky. The international socialist movement should understand that a failure of the revolution in Russia would retard and hamper, quote, the process of democratization in Central Europe, end quote. Kautsky's insistence on the need to convoke the Constituent Assembly in Russia was consistent with his analysis of the importance of democratic procedures for the future of that country. Kautsky observed that a radicalization was occurring in the internal struggle among those classes that, quote, took part in the destruction of the old government, end quote. He viewed with concern the possibility that this struggle might burn itself out without the creation of any general representative institution. Parenthesis. Kautsky did not mention Soviets, a form Kautsky would not have deemed suitable for the representation of all classes and therefore as the basis for a national government, end parenthesis. Quote, the election of the Constituent Assembly. The election of the Constituent Assembly, Kautsky wrote, quote, is an urgent necessity, not in order to neutralize the conflicts among classes and parties, but rather to permit a more accurate assessment of their strength and thus to lend their struggles a more rational foundation, end quote. Here they reemerged again. Here there reemerged again Kautsky's traditional theme of the need to endow any great state with a general technical political instrument of leadership. For Kautsky, this instrument could only be a constituent assembly and therefore a parliament. When the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia, Kautsky wrote a comment, Die Eroberung der Bolsheviki, in which Kautsky emphasized the dangers of a, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat in such a backward country and examined the factors that had led to Lenin's victory. But there was no, quote, condemnation of the insurrection. Kautsky's condemnation only came later, when the Bolsheviks dissolved the Constituent Assembly. Kautsky viewed as a break with an act which Kautsky viewed as a break with democracy. It is significant that Kautsky first hailed the advent of the Bolsheviks to power not in terms of a, quote, coup d'etat, but as the accession of the proletariat to power. Quote, for the first time in world history, the proletariat has now conquered governmental power in an entire great state, end quote. Kautsky. But Kautsky continued by adding, quote, how will all this end, end quote. Analyzing the social and economic conditions of Russia, Kautsky highlighted the difficulties facing the new regime, particularly the fact that 3/4 of the Russian population lived in a backward countryside, but Kautsky did not overlook some positive features. The existence in the great cities, the center of political life, a, quote, very modern large-scale industry, end quote. The revolutionary spirit of a proletariat, parenthesis, note this, end parenthesis, quote, completely free of the bourgeois traditions that burden the workers of Western Europe, end quote. The guidance of this proletariat by Marxist leaders. Thus, everything would depend on the way in which the contradiction of an advanced revolutionary proletariat in a generally very backward country was handled. Discussing the contrasting policies of the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks towards the problem that had divided the two currents of Russian socialism, how to prevent the, quote, exclusive power, end quote, of the bourgeoisie, Kautsky underscored the factors that had favored the triumph of the Bolshevik line. The Mensheviks had relied on a coalition government, the Bolsheviks on a dictatorship of the proletariat, supported by the revolutionary section of the peasantry, and on immediate peace. The peasants' hunger for land and the masses' desire for peace, neither of which had been satisfied, had swung the balance decisively to the Bolsheviks, assuring the Bolsheviks victory. But Kautsky continued, the very factors that had given the Bolsheviks victory posed a serious threat to the Bolsheviks after the seizure of power, because of the internal contradictions of class relations in Russia. The advanced proletariat, a minority, had been able to seize power in the cities, parenthesis, and thus make itself master of the entire country, since only the cities had real weight in a decisive contest, end parenthesis, by taking advantage of the democratic struggle of the peasants in the countryside. Now, however, the fact that the proletariat controlled only the cities would become a disadvantage. The workers would have to confront the anarchy in the countryside, and the danger of civil war would soar the moment the bourgeoisie was violently assaulted. Quote, the outlook of the Bolsheviks, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, was the most straightforward and corresponded more than any other to the class situation of the proletariat. But it also threatened to sharpen to the maximum the contradiction between the intense effort of the proletariat and the low level of development of the empire, end quote, Kautsky. The Bolsheviks now had to take account of the threats arising primarily from the particularism of the peasantry. Kautsky concluded that the Russian working class was not capable of introducing socialism, and that it should therefore refrain from installing a, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, since, quote, in the conditions of Russia, end quote, this would open the road to, quote, the political and social disintegration of the country, to chaos, and thus also to the moral bankruptcy of the revolution, to the counter-revolution, end quote. The Russian Revolution had so far been dominated by the failure of coalition governments, which could have completed their, quote, their mission only if they had rapidly achieved peace and convened the Constituent Assembly, end quote. The inability to satisfy these exigencies had led to the victory of the Bolsheviks. Given the unresolved problems in Russia, Kautsky did not take a position against the Bolsheviks in principle. Kautsky expected the Bolsheviks to act as a decisive force for a social change, which would not conflict with political democracy, parenthesis, which meant convocation of and respect for the Constituent Assembly, end parenthesis. Kautsky had respect for the Bolsheviks and something more as well. Quote, now, Kautsky wrote, quote, we will see whether the fears about their rise were justified. The Bolsheviks do not lack energy. In the Bolsheviks' ranks are extremely intelligent comrades, rich in experience, but the inherent difficulties of the real conditions are enormous. If they succumb in overcoming these real conditions, the difficulties of the real conditions, it will be something extraordinary. A new epoch of world history is beginning, end quote. Kautsky, looking forward to the advent of parliamentarism in Russia, parenthesis, when they took power, the Bolsheviks promised that they would do what none of the other governments since the February Revolution had done, namely convoke the Constituent Assembly, end parenthesis. Kautsky urged a parliament linked to the masses. Quote, the introduction of a parliament is one aspect of democratization, but it is not sufficient in itself. Important as the dependence of the government on parliament may be, it leads to democratization only when it is accompanied by the growing dependence of parliament on the popular masses. A parliament is deprived of strength when it cannot rely on the mass of the people, end quote. Kautsky, in other words, was reaffirming his classical point of view. Defense of universal suffrage and political democracy on the one hand, insistence on the role of socialists in bringing the social weight of the toiling masses to bear within political democracy and representative institutions on the other hand. The subsequent evolution of the Russian Revolution, especially the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly and the abolition of universal suffrage by the Bolsheviks, leading to what Kautsky was to call the, quote, dictatorship of the Russian communists, was to be denounced by him as a double betrayal of democracy and of socialism. It was then that the, quote, insurrection of the Bolsheviks, end quote, assumed the character of a coup d'etat in his eyes. That's the end of this section and the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening.